The summer afternoon was unbearably hot, the kind of heat that made the air feel thick and heavy, wrapping around everything like an oppressive blanket. Waves of warmth shimmered off the ground, distorting the world in a haze of golden sunlight. By the lake, the only oasis from the relentless sun, the sound of splashing water mixed with the carefree laughter of those lucky enough to be near its cool embrace. On the weathered wooden docks that stretched out over the lake, Daniel sat with his friends, their dark skin glistening with sweat. Their clothes, though worn and faded, did little to diminish the lightness in their spirits. They were more than just friends. They were family, bound not by blood but by shared struggles, whispered dreams, and an unspoken understanding of what it meant to grow up in a place where the world often turned a blind eye. Here, by the lake, the weight of reality loosened its grip, if only for a little while. Daniel leaned back on his elbows, his scuffed sneakers dangling just inches above the water. Around him, his friends flung a frisbee back and forth, their laughter cutting through the thick summer air. They teased one another with the kind of ease that came from years of trust, from knowing that no matter what happened outside of this moment, they had each other. Despite the hardships, his mother working long hours just to make ends meet, their tiny apartment with its peeling walls and creaking floors, Daniel never let those struggles define him. He found peace in these fleeting moments, surrounded by the only people who truly understood. Here, there were no expectations, no pity, no need to prove himself, just freedom. But that peace didn't last long. The deep, throaty rumble of engines shattered the calm, drawing Daniel's gaze toward the lake's entrance. A line of gleaming cars rolled to a stop, their polished exteriors catching the sun in a way that made them seem almost too bright, too perfect for a place like this. The doors swung open, and out stepped a group of teenagers, their laughter sharp, effortless, unburdened. Among them was Sarah. She moved with an ease that spoke of a life untouched by hardship. Her golden hair shimmered like silk in the sunlight, and her swimsuit, expensive and pristine, stood out starkly against the rugged simplicity of the lake. She was everything Daniel's world was not, everything his neighborhood had been told it could never be. Wealth, privilege, security. As Sarah and her friends made their way toward the water, their presence felt almost foreign, their carefree amusement a sharp contrast to the quiet resilience of the kids who usually filled this place. They didn't belong here, not really. And yet, here they were, oblivious to how their arrival shifted the air, to the unspoken divide that stretched between them and the ones who called this lake their escape. "I don't know, guys." Sarah's voice wavered as she hesitated near the water's edge, her gaze flickering with uncertainty. "I don't really know how to swim." Her friends groaned, rolling their eyes in exaggerated exasperation. "Come on, Sarah. Stop being such a baby," one of them teased, nudging her playfully yet insistently forward. "It's just a lake. What, are you scared of a little water?" Laughter rippled through the group, lighthearted on the surface, but laced with something sharper underneath. The kind of laughter that wasn't meant to comfort but to corner. Sarah's face flushed a deep crimson. The weight of their amusement, their expectations, pressed down on her like an invisible force. She could feel their eyes on her, judging, waiting. And then she noticed Daniel and his friends watching from across the lake. Did they think she was weak too? Did they see her as some fragile, pampered girl who had never had to push past fear? Something inside her tightened. "Fine," she snapped, squaring her shoulders even as her voice trembled. "I'll show you. I'll swim out there." Her friends erupted in cheers, their laughter growing louder. They didn't care if she was scared. They didn't care about the nerves tightening in her chest, the uncertainty pooling in her stomach. They just wanted a show. And now she had no choice but to give them one. Daniel watched, his expression unreadable. But he noticed things the others didn't. The stiffness in Sarah's movements, the way her hands curled into fists, the hesitation, fleeting but unmistakable, before she stepped forward. She wasn't ready for this. And yet, with her friend's laughter ringing in her ears, with the weight of expectation pushing her forward, she stepped into the water anyway. Here's a rewritten version of your scene with even deeper emotional weight and vivid language. The further Sarah ventured into the lake, the more the water seemed to shift around her, revealing its hidden depths. At first it was calm, lapping gently at her legs like a whisper, a false promise of safety. But the deeper she went, the more it changed. The water pulled at her, subtle at first. Just a tug here, a shift there. Yet she ignored it, pressing forward, determined to silence the mocking laughter still ringing in her ears. She didn't belong here. Not in this lake, not in this moment, but proving that she wasn't weak felt more important than the discomfort creeping into her chest. Her strokes became bolder, her steps more assured. But as she moved further out, something shifted. The water, once a mere inconvenience, became a force. The soft current grew stronger, swirling around her legs, making her footing uncertain. A shiver crawled up her spine, not from the cold, but from the growing realization that she had gone farther than she should have. Then her foot reached forward and found nothing. Panic ignited in her chest. She inhaled sharply, but the moment she did, the current wrapped around her, pulling her downward. She kicked hard, instinctively reaching for the lake bed, but there was nothing to hold on to. The water, once so harmless, had transformed into an enemy, relentless and unyielding. Her arms flailed, desperation taking over, but every movement only seemed to make things worse. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning as she fought to stay above the surface. The laughter of her friends still echoed from the shore, but it was distant now, detached, unaware of the battle she was fighting beneath the surface. She shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the water, lost in the sound of waves lapping against the dock. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly powerless. "Sarah, what's wrong?" a voice called, but it was filled with amusement, not concern. They didn't know. They couldn't see. Terror gripped her, cold and suffocating, as she realized the truth. No one was coming, but someone had seen. Daniel had been lost in his own world, his afternoon unfolding in the comfortable simplicity of laughter and quiet camaraderie. The lake had always been a sanctuary, a place where the weight of reality loosened its grip, if only for a little while. But all of that changed the moment he heard the fear in Sarah's voice. His head snapped up, his body tensed, and before his mind could fully process what was happening, his instincts took over. He ran. His friends called after him, their voices muddled by the rush of his own heartbeat, but he didn't stop. His feet pounded against the dock, and then, without hesitation, he dove. The coldness of the water was instant and shocking, stealing the breath from his lungs, but there was no time to think about that. His muscles burned as he pushed forward, cutting through the water, his arms pulling him closer to her. Sarah's head barely bobbed above the surface now, her limbs growing weak, her fight slipping away. Every stroke Daniel took felt like a battle against an invisible force, the current pushing against him, as if the lake itself was determined to keep her. He wasn't going to let that happen. "Sarah!" he called, but his voice barely reached her. When he finally reached her, her eyes locked onto his, wide, panicked, pleading. She was slipping. Daniel grabbed hold of her, his hands slipping slightly against her soaked skin, but he tightened his grip. He wasn't going to let her go. She clung to him instinctively, her body trembling, her movements weak. She wasn't just afraid. She was drowning. The current fought against him, trying to drag them both under. But Daniel pushed forward, every stroke feeling like it cost him a piece of himself. His lungs ached, his arms burned, but he didn't stop. The shore felt impossibly far, but giving up wasn't an option. He didn't think about the pain, the exhaustion, or the weight of Sarah's body in his arms. He thought only of getting her out. He kept going, kept fighting. And then, finally, his feet scraped against the soft lake bed. The moment he reached the shallows, his legs gave out, his body collapsing into the mud. But he didn't care. Sarah was still in his arms, still breathing, still alive. He pulled her onto the shore, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling from the effort. The relief hit him like a wave, crashing over him with the realization that he had done it. He had saved her. But before he could even catch his breath, the murmurs began. A crowd had formed, a tight, uneasy circle of well-dressed figures who stood at a distance, their expressions filled with something that wasn't quite gratitude. Some of Sarah's friends had their phones out, recording, their gazes flickering between Sarah's still body and Daniel's exhausted form. The whispers started softly, like ripples in the water, but they grew, swelling into something heavier. A tall boy, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Daniel's entire wardrobe, sneered. "What's this kid doing here?" he said, his voice laced with disdain. "He shouldn't even be near the water. What if he made things worse?" Daniel froze. The words struck like a slap, sharp and unexpected. A woman nearby, eyes narrowed with barely concealed judgment, leaned toward her friend and whispered just loud enough to be heard. "Can you believe it? He's just some poor kid from the slums. What made him think he could help?" The weight of the words settled over Daniel like a lead blanket. They weren't grateful. They weren't relieved. They weren't even acknowledging what had just happened. They were questioning why he had even tried. A girl, blonde and perfectly composed despite the chaos, crossed her arms and tilted her head, looking at Daniel as if he were an anomaly, something that didn't fit into her world. "Why is he even here?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge of condescension. "Shouldn't he be somewhere else?" The words twisted in his gut, sharp and cruel. Another voice chimed in, this one dripping with mockery. "Probably doesn't even know how to swim himself." Laughter. Daniel sat there, his hands still trembling, his heart still racing. He had pulled a girl from the depths of the lake, fought against the current, given everything he had to make sure she survived. And yet, none of that mattered. They didn't see a hero. They saw a black boy who had dared to cross an invisible line. His body ached from exhaustion, but the weight pressing down on him now was something else entirely. It wasn't just fatigue. It was the realization that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he fought, there would always be those who refused to see him as anything more than the circumstances he was born into. He had risked his life to save her, and all they saw was a boy who didn't belong. Daniel could feel his cheeks burning, not from the heat of the sun, but from the sharp sting of their words. The racism he faced in that moment cut deeper than any wound ever could. He had risked everything, thrown himself into the merciless waters to save Sarah, and yet to the eyes of those around him, he was nothing more than a black boy from the wrong side of town. No act of heroism could erase their prejudice. No selfless deed could make them see beyond the labels they had placed upon him. His mind swirled with confusion, his breath still ragged from the effort it had taken to keep Sarah alive. Should he stand his ground and call them out, force them to acknowledge what he had done? Or should he turn away, pretend their words didn't wound him as deeply as they did? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless. But then his gaze fell to Sarah, still unconscious, yet breathing. Alive. That was what mattered. He had saved her, and no amount of cruel whispers could change that. Yet even as he sat by her side, their mocking voices echoed in his mind, cruel and unrelenting. No matter how hard he had fought, no matter the sacrifice, there would always be those who refused to see him for the hero he was. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to push past the bitterness, to shake the injustice from his soul. And then, as if summoned by the tension in the air, the low rumble of an approaching luxury car shattered the heavy silence. The sleek black vehicle rolled to a stop, its engine cutting off abruptly. The crowd stilled, an unspoken anticipation gripping them as the driver's side door opened. From the car stepped a tall, commanding figure, John Davis, Sarah's father, a man whose wealth and power preceded him. His tailored suit was crisp, untouched by the dust and chaos surrounding him, yet his expression betrayed none of his usual composure. His eyes, sharp and searching, locked onto the still form of his daughter lying in the dirt. In an instant, all traces of authority melted into raw, unguarded concern. He moved quickly, reaching Sarah's side with urgency, his breath hitching as his fingers gently brushed across her forehead. His hands hovered over her, checking for injuries, searching for signs of life. When he saw her chest rise and fall, albeit weakly, a deep breath of relief escaped his lips. "Sarah, baby, are you okay?" His voice, thick with emotion, was barely more than a whisper. Sarah's eyelids fluttered, her gaze unfocused as she slowly came back to consciousness. She let out a weak groan, the sound breaking whatever invisible barrier had held John in suspense. He cradled her head, his grip firm yet tender, his face etched with gratitude and love. But as his gaze lifted, his expression shifted, not to the murmuring crowd, but to the boy still kneeling in the mud. Daniel, exhausted and trembling, was covered in grime. His body ached from the struggle against the water, his breath shallow as he knelt in silence. When John's eyes met his, there was a moment of stillness, a flicker of something unreadable in the older man's face. Then, in a way that Daniel had never experienced before, he saw something he hadn't expected: gratitude. The whispers of the crowd faded into insignificance as John straightened, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers. The murmurs that had filled the air, the judgment, the doubt, the quiet contempt, suddenly felt small, meaningless in the presence of the undeniable truth. John inhaled sharply, his voice firm, unwavering. "You saved my daughter's life." The words cut through the air, carrying a weight that none could ignore. It was a statement, a declaration that could not be disputed. "You didn't hesitate," John continued, his voice growing stronger, filled with something akin to reverence. "You did what no one else would." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Those who had mocked Daniel moments ago now stood motionless, their expressions shifting as reality settled over them. Some lowered their phones, suddenly aware of how small their judgment had been in the face of the truth. John's voice carried authority, but there was no arrogance in it, only a raw, undeniable sincerity. He turned to the bystanders, his gaze sharp. "Why are you questioning him?" His voice was laced with quiet fury. "He's a hero." Silence. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of their own shame. Embarrassment flickered across faces, but the damage had been done. The prejudice that had poisoned their words still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. John turned back to Daniel then, and something softened in his eyes. The concern he had held for his daughter now reflected in his gaze toward the boy who had saved her. The weight of the moment pressed down on Daniel's chest, making it hard to breathe. He had expected scrutiny. He had braced himself for dismissal. But this was different. "You've proven what kind of person you are," John said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I owe you everything." Daniel's heart pounded. He had never been acknowledged like this before, had never been seen beyond the assumptions people made about him. But here, in front of all those who had doubted him, John Davis, a man of immense power, a man who had no reason to care, was looking at him with nothing but gratitude and respect. John reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. With steady hands, he retrieved a check, scribbling something onto it before holding it out to Daniel. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll make sure you get everything you deserve, an education, a future. Whatever you need, I'll take care of it." Daniel stared at the check, his hands shaking as he reached out to take it. His mind reeled, struggling to process the enormity of the moment. This wasn't just money. It wasn't charity. It was an acknowledgement, a promise, one that shattered every lie he had been told about his own worth. For the first time, his future didn't feel like an impossible dream. It felt real, within reach. And for once, someone saw him for who he truly was. A hero. As time passed, weeks turning into months, Daniel's world began to transform in ways he had never dared to dream. With the unwavering support of Sarah's father, he was given a chance to step into a life that once felt unattainable. Enrolled in an elite institution, he walked through its grand halls with a mixture of awe and determination. This opportunity, which had once seemed like nothing more than an illusion, was now his reality. He stood out among his peers, not just for his background, but for the fire in his spirit. He was not merely content to exist within this new world. He was determined to conquer it. His hunger for knowledge was insatiable, his drive unstoppable. Though whispers still followed him, echoes of that fateful day by the lake, of the scorn he had once endured, He refused to let them define him. The sting of past prejudice lingered, but its power over him had waned. Hope now overshadowed doubt, and for the first time he saw a future brimming with possibility. His days were no longer dictated by struggle alone. They were filled with challenges, yes, but also with triumphs, discoveries, and purpose. He devoted himself to his studies. Each lesson learned a step closer to rewriting his destiny. The environment was unforgiving, filled with students who viewed him as an outsider, who saw his presence as an anomaly. Yet he did not waver. He carried within him an unshakable belief that he belonged, that he was worthy of this path he was forging. Years passed, and the day arrived when every sacrifice, every hardship, every moment of doubt had led him to this singular milestone. Graduation. The air in the ceremony hall crackled with energy, the sound of applause filling the vast space like a symphony of triumph. Dressed in his cap and gown, Daniel walked with his head held high, every step across the stage a testament to his resilience. The weight of his diploma in his hands felt like the tangible proof of his victory, proof that he had defied expectations, that he had risen beyond the barriers meant to keep him bound. As his eyes scanned the sea of faces before him, they found a familiar one near the front. John Davis. The man who had extended his hand when the world had sought to push Daniel down. The man who had seen him not for where he came from, but for who he truly was. John's expression was one of profound pride, his smile one of recognition, not of charity, but of earned success. Daniel had taken the opportunity given to him and forged it into something extraordinary. Among the faces in the crowd, another stood out, Sarah. She had watched Daniel's transformation from the boy who had risked everything to save her to the man who had claimed his place in the world. Their bond, once shaped by the desperate struggle in the lake, had deepened into an unbreakable friendship. As she met his gaze, her eyes glistened with pride. She knew what he had endured, the battles he had fought, and she also knew that this moment was not just about academic achievement. It was about proving a truth that should never have been questioned, that Daniel was more than the assumptions placed upon him, that he was more than just a boy from the wrong side of town. He was strong, he was brilliant, he was a hero. As the applause swelled around him, Daniel stood rooted in the moment, his heart swelling with emotion. This triumph was not his alone. It belonged to everyone who had believed in him, who had seen past prejudice and doubt, who had given him the chance to show the world his worth. And now, as he looked ahead, he knew his journey was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more barriers to break, but one thing was certain: he would face them with the same unwavering strength that had carried him here. His future was no longer confined by circumstance. It was vast, limitless, his to shape. And as he stepped off that stage, diploma in hand, he carried with him not just a piece of paper but a promise, to himself, to the world, that he would continue to rise, not because of where he came from, but because of who he was, because of who he had always been.